The private jet touched down in New York at 11:51 at night. My husband Julian walked down the steps, his hand resting comfortably on his new mistress's lower back. 3 states away, I lay in a sterile, freezing hospital room, holding our newborn son completely alone. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. The monitor beeped a steady, clinical rhythm, matching the sudden, absolute clarity in my mind. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. Julian was a Wall Street chief executive officer. Our marriage had never been a romance. It was a high-stakes merger that I had mistaken for a partnership. For 3 years, I existed in a silent cage of glass and steel, attending galas, smiling for the cameras, and absorbing his constant, calculated neglect. He dealt in futures, but he only ever offered me empty promises. I was an architect. I built structures meant to withstand earthquakes, yet I had allowed my own foundation to be hollowed out by a man who treated affection as a depreciating asset. For a long time, I justified it. There is an invisible chain that binds a survivor to a manipulator, forged over years of psychological conditioning. You learn to accept the unacceptable, because the erosion of your boundaries happens in millimeters, not miles. You convince yourself that the coldness is just stress, that the gaslighting is just a miscommunication. You become an expert at enduring, mistaking your high tolerance for pain as a sign of strength. You stay in the cage because the manipulator has convinced you that the locks are on the outside, when in reality, they have simply trained you not to push the door. I had endured the subtle jabs from his mother, Margaret, the isolated dinners, and the constant feeling that my value was tied entirely to my utility in their corporate empire. But staring at the hospital ceiling, feeling the fragile weight of my son on my chest, that invisible chain snapped. The nurses had whispered in the hallway, their soft sighs of pity slipping under the door as I labored alone for 14 hours. They thought I was a tragedy. They thought I was broken. But anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. I rubbed my eyes, attempting to summon regret or sorrow for the family I thought we were building, but there was only clarity. Every missed anniversary, every dismissive comment from his mother, it all compounded. I had let them treat my loyalty like an unlimited line of credit. But bankruptcy was imminent. I had been a silent investor in their version of family, footing the emotional bill while they reaped all the dividends. Now, the subscription was canceled. I looked at the small, sleeping face of my son and felt the last trace of my former self dissolve. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and Julian's account was about to be liquidated. I did not ask why he chose another woman over his pregnant wife. I did not care about the betrayal of the flesh. I cared about the breach of contract. I carefully reached for my laptop on the bedside table. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second before I began typing. No hesitation, no tears, only immediate, decisive action. The transition from victim to auditor happens in an instant when you realize the person you trusted has been keeping a second set of books. Julian thought I was safely tucked away, incapacitated by motherhood and grief. He thought he had left me in a deficit. He was wrong. I was already preparing the audit. 2 days later, Julian finally arrived at our estate. He did not come to the hospital. After 4 grueling days in the maternity ward, I had signed an early discharge waiver against medical advice, preferring to recover in solitude rather than wait in that sterile room. I had already checked myself out, arranged for a private car, and returned to the silent, echoing halls of the house we shared. I was sitting in the nursery, calculating my next move, when I heard the heavy oak front door open. From the top of the stairs, I listened as Julian's assistant, Warren, spoke. Warren had always been the diligent shadow, managing Julian's life down to the minute. I heard Warren's hesitant voice suggesting that Julian should go upstairs to see his newborn son. Julian's response was a masterclass in transactional indifference. "She can handle it," he said, his voice cold and flat. "She is an architect. She is used to managing projects on her own. She does not need me." I stood perfectly still. No gasp of shock, no shattered illusions, just another piece of empirical data to add to the ledger. He spoke about our son as if he were a delayed shipment, a logistical annoyance that did not require executive oversight. I walked out of the nursery and looked down from the landing. Julian was already flipping through documents, his mind entirely consumed by whatever acquisition he was plotting next. Warren, however, looked up and saw me. For 3 years, Warren had been loyal to the company line, enforcing Julian's schedule, running interference, and turning a blind eye to the emotional deficit in our marriage. But in that moment, as Warren looked from the indifferent chief executive officer to the woman standing quietly with a 2-day-old child, I saw the exact second his loyalty fractured. He was a numbers man, and the math of Julian's cruelty no longer added up. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand an explanation or throw a dramatic tantrum. I simply walked down the stairs, handed Warren a sealed envelope, and looked directly into his eyes. "Make sure this gets to my brother Daniel by tomorrow morning," I told him quietly. Warren took the envelope. He did not look at Julian. He just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the power shift that was already underway. Julian finally looked up, his brow furrowed in mild annoyance. "What is that?" he asked. "Administrative paperwork," I replied evenly. "Nothing that requires your immediate attention." He accepted the answer without a second thought, because arrogance breeds a very specific kind of blindness. He was so accustomed to my compliance that he could not fathom a scenario where I was the one setting the terms. He turned back to his files, dismissing me completely. That was his fatal error. He thought he was ignoring a dependent wife. He did not realize he was turning his back on a hostile takeover. I turned and walked back upstairs. The emotional distance between us was no longer a tragedy. It was a tactical advantage. Warren left the house 5 minutes later, carrying the envelope that would initiate Julian's total collapse. The war had not just begun. The first strike had already been launched. I did not waste time on arguments or futile demands for closure. Instead, I diverted my energy to the Montgomery Group, the international investment firm, where my brother, Daniel, served as chief investment officer. Daniel was not just family. He was a corporate apex predator. The envelope I had given Warren contained authorizations, access codes, and a directive to pull every legal document Julian and his mother had ever asked me to sign. By the time I arrived at Daniel's office the following afternoon, leaving my son safely with my trusted nanny, the boardroom table was already covered in blueprints of my marriage's financial structure. Daniel did not offer me pity. He offered me coffee and a team of corporate attorneys. "I have been the silent investor in their version of family," I told him, taking a seat at the head of the table. "I want to know exactly what I have been funding." We started with the postnuptial agreement Julian's mother, Margaret, had pressured me to sign 2 years ago under the guise of estate planning. At the time, Margaret had also pushed me to sign a blanket corporate power of attorney under the guise of streamlining our family trusts, claiming it was just standard administrative procedure for an executive's spouse. At the time, I had skimmed it, trusting the man I had married. Now, reading it through the cold lens of a hostile audit, the reality was horrifying. One of Daniel's lead attorneys pushed a highlighted page toward me. Buried deep within the dense legal terminology was a complex liability clause. It was explicitly designed to trigger in the event of a divorce. If we separated, the clause dictated that I would retain ownership of 3 specific subsidiary companies. On paper, it looked like a generous settlement. In reality, it was a legal trap. Daniel pointed to the corporate filings. "These aren't operational companies, Clara," he said, his voice deadly serious. "These are shell corporations. Julian has been using them to offload high-risk, toxic investments from his primary portfolio. If you divorce him, you do not just get the companies. You inherit the massive debt and the legal liability for every fraudulent trade he has made through them." I stared at the paper. They were not just planning to discard me, they were planning to bury me. They wanted to strip me of my assets, saddle me with their financial crimes, and walk away clean. Anger was entirely absent. What replaced it was a chilling, absolute precision. I had spent years designing buildings, calculating load-bearing walls and stress points. Julian and Margaret thought they had constructed an airtight legal prison for me. But every structure has a weak point if you know where to look. They wanted to make me the fall guy, I stated, the words sounding metallic and cold in the quiet room. They expected me to panic when the divorce papers were served, to sign whatever they offered just to escape the liability. Daniel leaned back in his leather chair. "What is our counter move?" he asked. "We don't counter," I replied, pulling the document toward me. "We dig deeper. If he is hiding toxic assets in my name, there is a shadow ledger. I want it. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was accounting. And I was going to balance the ledger down to the very last cent. We didn't waste a single minute. The Montgomery Group's forensic auditing team moved with lethal efficiency. For 48 hours, Daniel's specialists tracked the digital footprints Julian thought he had successfully erased. We converted an executive suite into a war room, replacing sleep with black coffee and relentless data extraction. I sat beside the lead auditor, treating the financial records like a complex architectural schematic. If Julian was moving toxic assets into shell companies under my name, the money he was siphoning had to be flowing somewhere else. We just had to follow the plumbing. The breakthrough came at 2:30 in the morning. An analyst flagged a recurring anomaly in the capital expenditure reports of Julian's primary holdings. Over the past 2 years, Julian had authorized tens of millions of dollars in payments for external consulting services. On a standard balance sheet, it looked like routine corporate strategy. But when the auditors cracked the corporate registry of the consulting firms, the structure of the shadow network was exposed. The firms were entirely fictitious. They had no physical offices, no employees, and no actual clients. They were registered in offshore tax havens, but the ultimate beneficial owners were deeply familiar. The network was controlled entirely by Julian, his mother Margaret, and his new corporate mistress, Chloe. They had built a massive, systematic asset stripping operation. Chloe, an ambitious vice president in his firm, was signing off on the fraudulent invoices. Julian was authorizing the payouts. Margaret was laundering the capital through her established philanthropic trusts to make the money disappear. They were bleeding the company dry, inflating their personal wealth while simultaneously sabotaging the subsidiary companies they planned to dump on me. I traced the flow of capital on the projected spreadsheet. It was a masterpiece of financial deception. They had monetized my trust, turning my marriage into a highly profitable, risk-free enterprise for themselves. "They weren't just cheating on you," Daniel said quietly, reading the final summary report over my shoulder. "They were running a corporate syndicate. I realize that," I replied, my voice devoid of any emotional inflection. Love was just a contract, and I was footing the bill. I did not feel heartbroken. I felt a profound, clarifying sense of power. The magnitude of their greed was their greatest vulnerability. By involving Chloe and Margaret, Julian had crossed the line from personal betrayal to federal financial fraud. He had tethered his entire empire to a criminal conspiracy. And now, I held the documentation. I looked at the names on the screen. Julian, Margaret, Chloe. They believed they were the architects of my destruction. They believed my silence was a symptom of weakness. They did not understand that I was simply surveying the demolition site. "Package this data," I instructed the auditing team, standing up from the desk. "Every invoice, every offshore transfer, every fraudulent signature. I want it verified, cross-referenced, and legally certified by tomorrow afternoon." Daniel looked at me, a sharp smile forming on his face. "Are we taking this to the authorities?" he asked. "Not yet," I answered, buttoning my coat. "If we go to the authorities, he goes to jail. But he keeps his dignity. I am not going to just lock him in a cell. I am going to tear down his empire in front of his board of directors." The final piece of the puzzle was not a financial ledger, but a digital confession. While the auditors finalized the asset stripping documentation, Warren, Julian's assistant, made his move. He had watched Julian dismiss his newborn son with absolute apathy, and that calculated cruelty had broken his allegiance. For months, Warren had quietly documented Julian's compliance violations, knowing he would eventually be scapegoated for the offshore transactions, and my son's birth was simply the final catalyst to hand over the file. Warren bypassed Julian's encrypted servers and secured a direct data dump of his personal communications. He delivered a hard drive to the Montgomery Group exactly 12 hours before Julian's annual shareholder meeting. We plugged the drive into a secure terminal. Daniel and I stood shoulder to shoulder as the screen populated with thousands of internal emails between Julian, Margaret, and Chloe. I utilized a search algorithm to filter the communications, looking for specific keywords related to the shell companies. A deeply buried email thread surfaced. The subject line was simply titled, "Exit Strategy." The thread was dated 7 months ago, right around the time we publicly announced my pregnancy. I clicked on the most recent message, authored by Margaret, and addressed to Julian, with Chloe copied on the distribution list. The words on the screen were clinical and devoid of any human empathy. "The timing of the separation must be precise," Margaret had written. "Wait until immediately after the birth. She will be physically compromised and emotionally distracted. Serve the papers then. The postnuptial liability clause will activate, and the toxic debt will transfer to her name before she has the capacity to mount a legal defense. The firm's primary assets will be shielded, and you can formalize the partnership with Chloe." It was a coordinated, premeditated execution. They had looked at my pregnancy not as the birth of a family, but as a tactical distraction. They had deliberately planned to weaponize my motherhood, using my most vulnerable moment to turn me into a financial human shield. They had smiled at baby showers, painted the nursery, and bought expensive cribs, all while actively engineering my ruin. I stared at the bright white screen. If there had been even a microscopic fragment of hesitation left in my mind, that email eradicated it. There would be no mercy. There would be no quiet settlement. Any illusion of shared humanity between us was permanently dead. This was not a betrayal fueled by temporary passion or momentary weakness. It was a cold, systematic operation designed to destroy my life for their financial gain. "They aren't just criminals," Daniel said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "They are monsters." "No," I corrected him, my tone perfectly flat. "They are a bad investment, and it is time to liquidate." I ordered the technical team to print physical copies of the exit strategy email thread, along with the offshore routing numbers and the fraudulent consulting invoices. We assembled 30 identical, heavy binders, one for every seat at the executive boardroom table. I checked my watch. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. Julian's shareholder meeting, where he planned to announce record profits and cement his control over the firm, was scheduled for 1 o'clock. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I just picked up my briefcase. "Call the legal team," I told Daniel, walking toward the exit. "We have a board meeting to attend." At exactly 1:15 in the afternoon, the heavy mahogany doors of Julian's executive boardroom swung open. Julian was standing at the head of the long table, projecting quarterly growth charts to a room full of major shareholders and board members. Chloe sat to his right, wearing a self-satisfied smile, while his mother, Margaret, watched from the corner, the undisputed matriarch of the empire. I walked in, followed immediately by Daniel and a phalanx of 6 corporate litigators. The room went completely silent. Julian's presentation faltered mid-sentence. "Clara?" he said, his voice laced with confusion and a sudden, sharp edge of panic. "What are you doing here?" "You should be at home with the baby." "I am handling administrative paperwork," I replied evenly, echoing the exact phrase I had used days ago. "Things that require my immediate attention." Before security could be summoned, my legal team dispersed, placing a thick, black binder in front of every board member. I walked directly to the head of the table and stood opposite Julian. The power dynamic shifted instantly. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. "Open the binders," I instructed the board. "You will find certified forensic audits detailing how your chief executive officer, his mother, and his vice president have been systematically bleeding this company dry through offshore shell corporations." The room erupted into frantic rustling as the board members tore into the documents. I watched the color drain from Julian's face. The illusion of his dominance was shattering in real time. There is a sociological concept regarding the illusion of power from an empty wallet. When wealth and authority are merely rented, acquired through deception rather than built on a solid ethical foundation, they create a fragile, hollow shell. Narcissistic individuals like Julian and Margaret confuse financial leverage with actual personal value. They believe that their bank accounts grant them invincibility, failing to realize that transactional power lacks structural integrity. When the moral foundation is absent, the entire edifice is just waiting for a strong enough breeze to collapse it. Money can buy compliance, but it cannot buy resilience against the truth. Within 3 minutes, the board realized they were looking at massive federal fraud. The chairman of the board, a severe man named Harrison, looked up, his face pale with fury. Consulting the corporate bylaws on emergency executive suspension, Harrison quickly moved for an immediate quorum vote. "Is this verified?" he demanded. "Every cent," Daniel answered, stepping forward. "My firm conducted the audit. Julian's electronic signature is on every fraudulent transfer, directly linking him to the asset stripping scheme outlined on page 4. Julian tried to speak, tried to spin the narrative, but the panic in his eyes betrayed him. Chloe was hyperventilating, staring at the printed emails that exposed her complicity. Margaret sat frozen, her aristocratic posture crumbling as she realized her philanthropic shield was gone. "Your electronic signatures are hereby invalidated," Harrison declared, slamming the binder shut. "Julian, you are relieved of your duties, effective immediately. Security will escort you and Chloe from the premises. Our legal counsel will be contacting the federal authorities." I looked at Julian. The arrogant, untouchable CEO was gone, replaced by a terrified man staring into the abyss of his own making. This wasn't revenge. It was a flawless, decisive accounting. The ledger was finally balanced. Julian collapsed into his leather chair, a hollow man stripped of the only currency he ever truly valued. The room was a flurry of chaotic corporate damage control, but I did not stay to watch the wreckage smolder. I had delivered the evidence, neutralized the threat, and secured my absolute freedom. I turned my back on the boardroom, walking out of the glass building and stepping into the crisp, bright afternoon air without a single backward glance. Julian faced immediate criminal indictments. The federal authorities froze his assets. The board seized his remaining equity to cover the corporate losses, and Chloe quickly turned state's evidence to save herself, ensuring his complete isolation. Margaret's social empire dissolved overnight, leaving her bankrupt and entirely alone in a world that only respected the wealth she no longer possessed. They had built their fortress on deceit, and it had pulverized them. I did not revel in their misery. I simply moved forward. I returned to my roots in architecture, but this time, I built something that actually mattered. Using my own secured assets and backing from the Montgomery Group, I established a foundation dedicated to designing and building affordable, high-quality housing complexes for single mothers. I took the structural remnants of my own betrayal and engineered a sanctuary for women who were fighting to rebuild their lives from zero. I had spent years trying to maintain a facade that was fundamentally flawed, pouring my energy into a foundation that was designed to fail. Now, the architecture of my life was entirely my own design. Holding my son in the safety of our new home, surrounded by the genuine warmth of my brother and true friends, I found absolute peace. I've come to realize that holding on to anger is just another way of letting the manipulator keep their hands on your life. Letting go of a toxic relationship is not a failure. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Life is not a frantic race to secure the loyalty of people who view you as a commodity. It is a deliberate, daily journey of constructing an impenetrable fortress of self-worth out of the shattered pieces of betrayal. You do not negotiate with people who want to destroy you. You audit them, you cut your losses, and you walk away. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, it's the only way to set yourself free. I did not need Julian's apology, and I did not need his remorse. I only needed my own strength, and I had found it. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and let me know in the comments. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic space to find your true power? See you in the next story.